Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're setting the stage for a deeply fascinating, completely reality-grounded look into India's port-adjacent special economic zones, or SEZs. Look, if you've been following trade news lately, you've definitely seen some incredibly dramatic headlines. Stuff claiming a massive, overnight overhaul is fundamentally rewriting how India's maritime trade operates. But to truly understand what's actually happening on the ground at some of the world's busiest ports, we really need to strip away all that hype. Our goal today is to explain everything in depth. We're going to look at the actual laws, the unique jurisdictional fictions, and the literal billion-dollar numbers driving Indian maritime trade today.
Okay, let's dive into this, because the very first thing we need to address is the giant elephant in the room. Is a sweeping new law radically altering Indian maritime trade right this second? The short, honest answer? No, it's really not. But you know what? The real story is actually far more interesting than the headlines. We're going to directly question that sensationalized narrative and look at the actual undeniable mechanics of what is playing out on the ground in 2026.
For years, the major expectation was a wholesale replacement of the SEZ Act of 2005. The chosen vehicle for this was supposed to be the DESH Bill, the Development of Enterprise and Service Hubs Bill. It was highly anticipated, first announced back in the 2022 budget, and it promised this dramatic regime change. But, well, reality played out a bit differently. The DESH Bill has been completely stalled out over some pretty serious interministerial disagreements. Basically, the Ministry of Commerce and the Ministry of Finance just couldn't align on tax treatments and domestic market access. So where does that leave us? As of June 2026, reporting indicates the government has effectively shelved the DESH Bill altogether. Instead, they're pursuing what they're calling SEZ 2.0. This is a much slower, piecemeal, amendment-based process run by a 17-member committee. It's very much an incremental evolution, definitely not an overnight revolution.
Here is the roadmap for this explainer. 1. Unpacking the reform hype. 2. The SEZ legal fiction. 3. The 2025 tech shift. 4. Parallel Track Ports Act. And finally, 5. The billion-dollar scale.
Section 1. Unpacking the reform hype. Let's start by laying out the actual timeline so you can see exactly how this reform process is unfolding in real time. Back in 2022, the Grand DESH Bill was announced. Tons of excitement, but nothing sweeping ever materialized. Then, jump to June 2025, and we got some very specific, narrow SEZ rule amendments, which, don't worry, we'll explain in depth shortly. By March 2026, a 17-member SEZ 2.0 committee was quietly put together under the Ministry of Commerce and Industry, and by June 2026, it became crystal clear that the flagship DESH Bill was officially shelved. What this timeline proves is that we are absolutely watching a gradual, amendment-based pathway. It's a slow burn, not a sudden explosion of policy. Let's move to and see how this builds into Section 2, the SEZ legal fiction. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the core concept of a deemed foreign territory. This is the fundamental legal fiction that makes an SEZ completely distinct from the rest of India, and it dictates how these hubs operate while we wait for new laws. Imagine a designated, completely duty-free enclave. It sits physically squarely inside India's sovereign borders. But legally speaking, for the purposes of trade, tariffs, and customs, the law essentially puts blinders on and pretends it is foreign soil. It's a brilliant legal workaround. To really explain this in depth, let's break down this legal geography step by step. This will show you exactly why these SEZs are almost always located right next to major ports. Step 1, a massive vessel arrives at an Indian port. Step 2, because the adjacent SEZ is that deemed foreign territory, cargo can move directly off the ship and right into the SEZ without routine customs inspections and without paying basic customs duty or integrated GST. It's totally seamless, literally a frictionless transfer. But here's the catch with Step 3. The exact moment those goods cross out of the SEZ and into mainland India, which is legally known as the Domestic Tariff Area or DTA, that invisible border is tripped. That is when full customs duties and import policies instantly kick in, exactly as if the goods were just freshly imported from overseas. Section 3. The 2025 Tech Shift. With that unique legal foundation in mind, let's look at the concrete regulatory changes that did actually manage to pass recently. On June 9, 2025, the government announced the SEZ Amendment Rules. But it's absolutely crucial to understand just how narrow the scope is here. This was not some broad, sweeping maritime reform. It was targeted strictly at semiconductor and electronic component manufacturing, period. It allowed SEZ units in those specific tech sectors to sell their goods into the domestic tariff area after paying duties, which was a path that was previously highly restricted.
It also permitted free-of-cost goods to count toward a mandatory net foreign exchange calculation that these businesses have to satisfy. The direct named beneficiaries of this change were major tech players. We're talking about Micron's semiconductor SEZ in Sanand, Gujarat, and the Aquis Group's electronics component SEZ down in Tarwat, Karnataka.
And as this quote summarizes perfectly, this is a real 2025 reform, but it's honestly a manufacturing policy story more than a maritime trade one. This was a very real, very important reform for 2025, but we have to be precise about what it does. It is fundamentally a manufacturing policy. It's all about boosting microchip and electronics production. We really shouldn't conflate this highly targeted tech policy with a broad restructuring of port jurisdiction or general maritime trade. Section 4, Parallel Track Ports Act. And this brilliantly illustrates the dual reality we're dealing with. If the SEZ rules are moving slowly and focusing primarily on tech, what is actually impacting the broader maritime infrastructure? Well, on one side, you have the SEZ 2.0 committee operating under the Ministry of Commerce. They are handling the slow-moving trade, the tariff policy, and maintaining that deemed foreign legal fiction we just discussed. On the entirely separate other side, you have the Indian Ports Act of 2025. This act is what actually reshapes the physical port governance layer that those SEZs sit right next to. It establishes state maritime boards for non-major ports and sets up a Maritime State Development Council. So you've got these two tracks, trade policy on one hand, physical infrastructure governance on the other. They are highly interactive for sure, but they are completely separate legal tracks moving at completely different speeds. Section 5. The billion-dollar scale. So why does this seemingly dry legal mechanism of deemed foreign territory matter so much? Why are we explaining it in depth? The answer is in the sheer massive scale of it all. Even with the highly publicized DESH bill stalled out, the existing SEZ framework is an absolute economic powerhouse. Get this. As of March 2025, India has 276 operational special economic zones, and those zones directly employ an astounding 3.17 million people. That is millions of human livelihoods entirely dependent on the flawless execution of this precise legal structure. So the crucial point is the massive national economic footprint this creates. Just through December 31 of 2025, goods exports from these Indian SEZs reached a staggering $133.45 billion. That is an almost unfathomable volume of trade flowing directly through those invisible legal borders we just mapped out, utilizing that frictionless, duty-free transit right off the vessels. To bring that massive national number down to a single, concrete, port-linked illustration, let's just look at the Kandla SEZ in Gujarat. Between April and December of 2025 alone, this single port-adjacent SEZ generated over $28 billion in export value. Just one location. It perfectly proves why understanding the deep mechanics of an SEZ isn't just some boring legal trivia. It is quite literally the fundamental operating system for billions of dollars in global commerce. We've seen today that the reality on the ground isn't a single dramatic new law changing everything overnight. Rather, it's two distinct tracks. You've got the infrastructure-focused Indian Ports Act of 2025 on one side, and the slow, piecemeal, amendment-driven SEZ 2.0 committee on the other. This entire massive system relies on a decades-old legal fiction that quietly moves billions of dollars of cargo without routine friction. So the final, provocative question I want to leave you with is this. As these dual tracks continue to evolve at their own very different speeds, how will this highly lucrative, deemed foreign legal fiction adapt next to fuel the coming $1 trillion of Indian maritime trade? Thank you so much for joining this explainer, and remember to keep a close eye on those incremental amendments. They are exactly where the real future of trade is being written.